Hello, my name is Will Norman, and this is a short talk about Tennessee Williams's 1947 play, A Streetcar Named Desire, one of the most important plays of the American 20th century. I'm going to talk about a specific aspect of the play, an aspect which is often overlooked by those who are reading it rather than watching it, and that is I want to pay some close attention to the non-verbal elements of the play, which nevertheless contribute to its effects and its meanings. I'm talking here about the aspects of theatrical production, such as music, sound and lighting, costume, and set design. These aspects can be gathered together under the term stagecraft. They're common to many, if not all, theatrical productions, but in the work of Tennessee Williams and in A Streetcar Named Desire in particular, they take on a special significance for two reasons. One is that Williams made a conscious decision to elevate stagecraft from its traditional role as a secondary technical concern to being a central one. One indication of this is the way in which he integrated various detailed cues as to the various aspects of stagecraft into his script. We know exactly what kind of clothes Stanley is to wear at particular moments. We know the palette of colours that's to be made visible during the poker scene. We have a fairly clear sense of what music is to be played at different points in the play, sometimes Williams even specifying particular songs. He tells us how light is to fall on the set, that shadows are to be projected onto it at certain points, and so on. Williams is very specific about the arrangement of interior space in the apartment, with its two rooms and its bathroom. He understood these aspects of the play to contribute to what he called the plastic theatre. He saw plastic theatre as an experimental route forwards in modern drama, a way to overcome the dominant way of doing things in 1940s American theatre, which he described as an exhausted theatre of realistic conventions. We'll talk a little more about realism later, and we'll come to see how Williams saw plastic theatre as challenging and adapting the meaning of realism. But for the moment, the second reason why stagecraft took on a special significance in A Streetcar Named Desire is that Williams incorporated it into the plot and the dialogue of his play in a very explicit fashion. In Streetcar, the characters themselves, and especially Blanche, create their own stagecraft. In fact, we can understand Blanche as a character obsessed with the managing of the production of her own private play, in which she is the leading lady. We witness her choosing her clothes from the costume box. We find her turning on the radio to create her own musical accompaniment, and most prominently of all, we find her arranging her own lighting with those Chinese lanterns that become such a potent symbol in the play. Stanley, of course, is bent on disrupting Blanche's stagecraft, rifling through her costume box, throwing the radio out of the window, and tearing down the lantern. In this sense, stagecraft provides one of the most important arenas for dramatic conflict in the play, as Stanley and Blanche each try to control the production of their own theatrical atmosphere in the apartment. He does it with mess and disorder and destruction, she with carefully curated but fragile genteel touches. Williams was certainly not the first playwright to incorporate theatrical production self-consciously into the plot of his play. But, in the context of 1947, in comparison to the fashions of mainstream theatre in America at that time, what he was doing was quite striking and even idiosyncratic. Before we go on to look in more detail at how Williams used stagecraft as an integral part of Streetcar, there is another implication we need to think about first. In studying plays as part of a literature course at school or at university, we're liable to think of the production of the play's meaning and its effects as being the responsibility of the playwright. And if we're simply reading the script as a text in isolation, then that is necessarily true. But when we begin to think about stagecraft, however, we are obliged to lift the play imaginatively from the page and consider it as part of a broader range of artistic activities that are performed each time the play is staged, each of which makes its own contribution. The playwright is no longer the only and perhaps not even the most important person involved in producing the meaning and effects of the play. We have to think about the way the playwright collaborates with figures such as the director, the stage designer, the writer of the score, the costume designer, and so forth. As I've mentioned, in Williams's case, the playwright went further than was conventional in providing these figures with cues relating to his work. Nevertheless, we need to think about his stagecraft in the context of his collaborators, those who directed the play and who designed its set, for instance. The first Broadway production of Streetcar at the Barrymore Theatre in 1947 was hugely influential on the subsequent productions of the play, including the 1951 film, which remains a benchmark today. It starred Marlon Brando and Jessica Tandy. It was directed by Elia Kazan and featured set design by Joe Mielziner. This was a team largely handpicked by Williams himself and represented some of the best talent working in Broadway at the time. In the case of Mielziner, he'd worked with Williams before on The Glass Menagerie in 1944, and their joint experience certainly informed the way that Williams conceived of the theatrical space in Streetcar. Kazan was the most in-demand director on Broadway, known for his commitment to exploring social and political issues in his work. Kazan had huge influence on many aspects of Streetcar, its stagecraft included. That means casting, set design, music, and lighting. And this influence ran to the extent that he made over 100 suggestions to Williams to make revisions to his script, many of them made in relation to things like costume and lighting. The Streetcar script you're reading today would look very different without Kazan's collaboration with Williams. Kazan also went on to direct the film adaptation of Streetcar, which starred Marlon Brando in 1951. As well as having a direct influence over Williams's script for Streetcar then, Kazan and Mielziner also helped to shape that first Broadway production and the subsequent film in ways that have impacted how people understand the play right up to the present. All subsequent versions of Streetcar must reckon with Kazan's violent, fast-paced directing style and Mielziner's translucent interior walls, even when they depart from them, just as all actors playing Stanley must work in the shadow of Brando's incredibly physical, athletic, and priapic Stanley. Let's take an example from the play of the way in which Williams manages to incorporate aspects of stagecraft into the plot, Blanche's use of lighting. When we first meet her in scene 1, Williams tells us in a note that Blanche's delicate beauty must avoid a strong light. This kind of direction is typical of Williams's approach through the play, which tends to avoid giving explicit instructions to his production team and prefers rather to offer hints and clues that can be interpreted by them. This one is relevant to the actor playing Blanche, also the makeup artist and the director, the lighting director and the stage designer. There's something about her uncertain manner, he goes on, as well as her white clothes, that suggests a moth. Knowing the play as we do, we see in this direction an introduction to several of its major themes which will be carefully developed. Blanche requires illusion in order to maintain her allure, and yet her fate is always already marked out for her, a delicate creature drawn unconsciously to her own destruction. The white clothes mentioned here, incidentally, were Kazan's idea, because Williams originally had Blanche in a blue dress, but Kazan thought white would help her to bring out her vulnerability, as well as providing a clearer contrast with Stanley's brightly coloured clothes. Tracing what we might call the moth and light theme through the plot and stagecraft in Streetcar is an instructive exercise. Williams's opening directions for scenes 3 set out the need for lurid nocturnal brilliance in the kitchen and an electric bulb with a vivid green lampshade. These are precisely the effects that will draw the moth to its doom. But the bedroom, by contrast, is dimly lit, and this is where Blanche, here and throughout the rest of the play, is most at home, trying to control the environment to suit her need to avoid strong light. The artificial light of the electric bulb is echoed in minor key by the lit match, which Mitch offers to Blanche with which to light her cigarette, the beginning of their own, more gentle, erotic entanglement. And later Blanche tells him that she can't stand a naked light bulb, and she asks Mitch to cover the bedroom lights with a cheaper paper lantern bought on Bourbon Street. The 1947 Broadway production, incidentally, had its own problems with electric bulbs. It cost them $160 to have the paper lantern specially adapted to meet New York City fire regulations. Now we turn to Williams's directions for the opening of Scene 4, the morning after Scene 3's drunken poker night. Stella, unlike Blanche, is comfortable in bright light, and Williams tells us that her face is serene in the early morning sunlight, and that the door to her room is slightly ajar on a sky of summer brilliance, a direction which must have cost the lighting designer some thought, as he or she tried to work out how to use the artificial theatre lights to create the effect of natural light, to contrast the electric ones from the previous scene. If Stella is all peace in Scene 4, then Blanche, we're told, is all anxiety underneath this brilliant light. The subsequent action and dialogue go on to elaborate and embellish this contrast, which has been set up by the stage directions. In Scene 5, meanwhile, in Blanche's long dialogue with Stanley, the moth and light theme is taken up directly. Blanche talks about what she calls soft people, those who need to put on colours, the colour of butterfly wings, in order to receive shelter. Such soft people, she tells him, need to put a paper lantern over the light. In Scene 6, she creates an equivalent effect by lighting a candle in imitation of a bohemian cafe in Paris. But in Scene 7, it's Stella who uses candles to place in Blanche's birthday cake. We should notice the way the theme is maintained by a mixture of dialogue, action, and stagecraft, carried in one scene by what a character says, and in another by the way the actors and set are physically illuminated. Williams's particular skill here is in weaving the two to the point that they appear seamless and unified. In Scene 8, it's Stanley as well as Blanche who makes direct reference to the moth light theme in his dialogue with Stella, when he reminisces about their active sexual life before Blanche arrived, and his desiring its return after she leaves, and he uses the striking metaphor, "get the coloured lights going," which anticipates the brightly coloured pyjamas that he'll wear when he rapes Blanche in Scene 10. They contrast with the much weaker light of Blanche's birthday candles. The theme finds its grand, melodramatic conclusion in Stanley's violent action in the final scene, when he tears Blanche's paper lantern and hands it to her, symbolizing the final destruction of her attempts to manage her stagecraft. Blanche cries out, Williams tells us, as if the lantern were herself. This brief attempt to trace a single theme through the play, as it appears both in the dialogue and in the stagecraft, has by no means been exhaustive, and there are many more instances of it than I've been able to emphasize. What I've tried to show, though, is the intricacy and richness of the way that Williams weaves stagecraft into the play's most profound concerns. In practical terms, this technique posed tremendous challenges to the production team, but thanks to their own expertise and indeed their reciprocal influence on Williams, the overall effects were successful. Take, for example, Williams's rather specific stage direction in Scene 6, when Blanche and Mitch return from their night out and enter the apartment. At that moment, we read, the outer wall of the building disappears, and the interiors of the two rooms can be dimly seen. How can one make a wall disappear? The answer lies with Joe Mielzner's innovative stage design, which used a transparent material called scrim, a translucent material called scrim, for the exterior walls of the apartment. Scrim can be made to appear transparent or opaque depending on the type and angle of the light which is shone on it. Mielzner was a master of its use and navigated Williams's complex directions for the traffic between inside and outside action by exploiting its properties. Screens made from scrim helped Mielzner to control how and when light entered the stage space, and to make walls appear and disappear at will, drawing the audience's attention when necessary, and then dissipating it. In this way, internal atmospheres could be made dreamlike and hazy when the script required, as for example when Blanche is living memories from the past, or they can be made clean and harsh, as for example in the kitchen during the poker scene. Mjølner himself wrote that if translucent scenery of this type hadn't existed, then Williams would have invented it. Such is its centrality to his art. And specifically, what it allowed Williams to do was to use stagecraft to illuminate not just the action of the play, but its characters' inner states. As he wrote, quote, "It was a true reflection of the contemporary playwright's interest in, and at times obsession with, the exploration of the inner man." This is a point worth dwelling on because it will return us to my earlier comments about Williams's desire to confront and transcend the tired realist conventions he saw in 1940s American theatre. Those realist conventions prioritized the representation of external surfaces. Anger, if it needed to be conveyed, was conveyed through the physical actions of the actor and through their speech. The environment around them, however, had to retain a standard of verisimilitude. This mode, verisimilitude, might be compared to the way we expect a photograph to represent reality, as it is seen. In the realist way of thinking, there's no such thing as an angry room or an angry object, insofar as someone might be angry in that room, or throw that object in anger. It must be noted that this form of realism does play a part in Streetcar. When Brando as Stanley gets angry, he snarls and throws things around with a brutal kind of realism. Indeed, Brando's style of method acting itself emphasizes a kind of reality principle, insofar as method actors try to internalize the experience and motivations of the characters that they play. And they do this in order to reproduce a verisimilitude of speech and action. Brando, in a sense, really is furious when he throws his dishes at the wall, and therefore Stanley is too. Streetcar doesn't completely reject realism then. What it does, though, is to incorporate that realism into a wider vision, which also takes considerable interest in representing characters' interior states, what Mjølner called inner man, and it does this using stagecraft. Williams was not the first to attempt to do this. The name given to this desire to use external means to represent internal states was expressionism, and it was developed by European dramatists in the early 20th century. However, Williams's signature blend of realism and expressionism was entirely his own. Okay, let's look at how this might work in practice by examining scene 10. By this point in the play, Blanche's grasp of reality has clearly begun to slip, and her psychological turmoil has increased. The challenge for Williams, and for the actor playing Blanche, and indeed for the whole production team, can be understood as this. How can one represent the unrepresentable? How can one take the inner workings of a consciousness, perhaps even an unconsciousness, the contents of which are concealed even from the individual experiencing it, and make it sensible to an audience? I say make it sensible rather than understandable, because this kind of experience is by its nature resistant to understanding and reason. We can't understand Blanche's terror and anxiety, but we might be able to sense it through seeing and hearing non-verbal stimuli such as music or shadows. We might even be able to recreate in ourselves some effect comparable to that being experienced by Blanche herself, though clearly not exactly the same. This kind of process is entirely foreign to realism. A realist approach would be obliged to have Blanche describe her terror, to look anxious and terrified, to behave in an anxious and terrified way. But these strategies, Williams judged, were unable to bring about the effect that he required. The experience would always be Blanche's, not ours. The audience would hold it at a distance and imagine it using their powers of reason, but they wouldn't sense it and they wouldn't grasp its all-pervading power. To be sure, Blanche does all of these things, but Williams's innovation lies in the way he uses sound and light in this scene to show what can't be absorbed by realist techniques. Blanche even tells Stanley in this scene, as she struggles to contain her fear, that, quote, "we have to be realistic. But as she loses control, it's clear that realism isn't adequate to convey that inner state. This is an excess of feeling, if you like, one which can't be contained in Blanche's performance and must therefore be expressed in some other way, as it spills over its container and threatens to overwhelm the entire theatrical space. As Stanley enters the bedroom, Williams tells us that, quote, lurid shapes appear on the walls around Blanche. The shadows are of a grotesque and menacing form, unquote. Then, as Blanche puts down the phone, with which she tries to call for help, these effects are augmented by sound, and the direction notes that the night is filled with inhuman voices, like cries in a jungle. It's important that these voices are not resolved into recognizable verbal signs, into words, for what Williams is attempting to give us is precisely something which is not representable in language. At this moment, Mjelzaner's transparent walls come into effect as the light angle shifts and an exterior scene is disclosed through the scrim of a prostitute rolling a drunk. This is a tremendously important moment because of the way the stagecraft discloses a permeability between inside and out, as the barrier which separates them is broken down and the interior state and the external world become united. As the scene comes to its climax and Stanley carries Blanche to the bed, Williams calls on the hot trumpet and drums from a nearby nightclub to sound, evoking Stanley's unrestrained sexuality. Like the view of the prostitute rolling the drunk, this sound unites the realist content of the play with its expressionistic psychological content. The world outside and the world inside become one. In summary, then, we can't fully grasp Streetcar until we pay full attention to its form as a play, and the particular emphasis that Williams and his collaborators placed on the theatrical work that takes place within and beyond the script with regard to sound, light, and set design. Williams was attempting here a new approach to theatre, which combined elements of the dominant style of realism with elements of expressionism. His way of combining them involved incorporating aspects of stagecraft into the action and dialogue of the play in ways that were inseparable from its larger themes and concerns. He achieved this not simply through his own work, but through his collaborations with others, most notably the director Elia Kazan and the set designer Joe Mjelzaner. Indeed, it's hard to know where his work ends and theirs begins. The collaborative achievement is not just an artistic one, in the conventional sense of the word, but also a technical one, a series of practical answers to the questions posed by the play. How can we make walls disappear? How can we have an outside and an inside that are separate but also permeable? How can we represent the unrepresentable? Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.